Welcome to Larry the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. On today's episode, 5 bands from the 80s that I didn't like back then, but that I like now. None of these are metal bands. None of these are really even what I would consider to be hard rock bands. But back in the 80s, when I first started getting into music, if something didn't have a lot of guitar in it, a lot of riffing, a lot of heaviness to it, I wasn't particularly interested in it, unless it was like an older classic thing like the Beatles or something like that. I just didn't like. It needed to have guitar in it. It needed to have riffs for me, or I couldn't appreciate it. As I've gotten older, I've learned to like a lot of different things now. My tastes have expanded. I've matured with my tastes, and I found myself going back and revisiting a lot of the stuff from the 80s, a lot of the synth pop and melodic stuff, and appreciating it for what it is. And in the last like 10 years or so, I would say that I've also really gotten into like electronic stuff like dark wave and goth type music and stuff like that. So that has also caused me to kind of go back and revisit a lot of the stuff from the 80s that I just didn't really listen to and didn't really give it a chance because it just didn't have it wasn't heavy enough for me. So all right, one of those bands is and this is a big one. I really David Bowie. I really love David Bowie now. I've got a bunch of his records, but at the time, especially in the 80s when he was doing like Let's Dance and stuff, that's still not my favorite era from him. I like the 70s stuff. I like his Berlin phased Ziggy Stardust stuff. I like his like the album he put out before he passed away. I think is amazing. So I've come to really love and get into David Bowie. I saw a David Bowie tribute band not that just like a couple weeks ago, and I absolutely loved it. And he's one of those people where now I understand, I appreciate the way he was able to change his styles and his image, and he was always sort of exploring different things and doing different things, and I've learned to appreciate that. And his songcraft is fantastic. I think he has an amazing voice, and there is some guitar in some of the earlier 70s stuff like the Ziggy Stardust era stuff and stuff like that. But I've even loved the his more keyboardy type stuff and his more experimental stuff. All right, kind of along the same lines. I can't say I get into these guys as much as David Bowie, but the Talking Heads, I've learned to appreciate them. David Byrne, right? I think that's the lead singer's name. He's another guy that's sort of like artsy and everything, and I kind of dig the way they experiment. And this is sort of a recent thing, me kind of going back and revisiting them and exploring some of their catalog, because again, they're a band that I just pretty much completely ignored when I was younger, because it just wasn't, where's the guitar? It just wasn't, where's the riff? It just wasn't heavy enough for me. Okay, next is The Cure. Now, this is a band that I've really gotten into because I just mentioned that in the last 10 years or so, I've gotten into like dark wave and goth stuff. And it's caused me to, as I've delved into goth music, led me back to The Cure. And honestly, I'm going to be making a whole video on my experiences in the goth world because I think it's kind of interesting, and I'm kind of curious about other people's if they have any experience in that. But I never even knew that The Cure were considered like this goth band. It's still sort of hard for me to wrap my head around, but they're a band that their earlier stuff I think is really cool. And even though there is guitar in their music, there isn't any like big heavy distorted guitar like you would find in Black Sabbath, but the stuff it is very moody, and it is kind of dark, but it's a dark in a different way rather than the apocalyptic or occultish darkness of a lot of heavy metal. This is more like moody and brooding, relationships gone bad, and stuff like that. So The Cure is my number 3. Number 4, this one again is directly because of the synthy type stuff that I've been into in the last so many years. But Gary Newman, I've come to really like Gary Newman. He's somebody who he's a lot darker than I remember him being in the 80s. Everybody knows him for the song Cars, but he has a lot of really great albums that he's doing different things. And again, it's really moody. And I kind of like as a, and I was just this thing in the last so many years that I'm appreciating more and more things that don't really have guitar in them, and a lot of his stuff doesn't really have guitar in it. And I just dig the moods and the sounds and the textures and everything that he's able to do. His most recent album, which I forget the name of it, I can picture the cover in my head, I really really like. So Gary Newman, he's somebody that I've come to appreciate in the last so many years. In fact, it was really like probably going back, man, probably like 15 years ago when one job I had, there was somebody that worked there, and they were like the president of the Gary Newman fan club. And I was like, really? The guy that did Cars? And he's like, oh, he's so much more than Cars. This was before streaming, so I wasn't able to really check it out or anything, but he was, oh, you have to listen to this, and this, it's just, he's so much more than just that one song. And I eventually did get around to diving into his catalog, and I agree, he is so much more than just the song Cars. All right. The last one, and this one is, you would probably think of these guys as a 70s band, but they were getting played on MTV and stuff in the 80s, but The Clash. I've never been a huge punk fan, and The Clash has a fair amount of guitars in it, but I remember buying the Combat Rock album, getting it on cassette, one of those record club things. It was one of the albums that I picked because I just thought, what the heck? And I just didn't understand it. I didn't get it. I thought it was going to be heavier than it was. It wasn't. It seemed just strange to me the way they shifted to all these different things. I didn't get it. I was thinking it was going to be punk rock like the Ramones or the Sex Pistols, and I heard Should I Stay or Should I Go, and that sounded fairly heavy. So I thought the whole album was going to be like that, and it just confused me. But as time went on, I bought the London Calling album, and I just loved that. And I just learned to appreciate the different stuff that they did, the different sounds that they incorporated in their music, the different styles and everything. It didn't have to all be about the guitars. And I guess that's the moral of this. As I got older, I started to be able to get away from, all right, it doesn't always have to be about heavy riffs and heavy guitars and stuff like that. I've learned to appreciate different types of music and different sounds and stuff like that. So, okay, are there any bands from when you were a teenager, that's the 70s or the 80s, whenever that was, or the 90s, whenever that was, like a band from the 90s, this wasn't on my list, but if I were to bring up a band from the 90s, it would be Nine Inch Nails. And again, here's this sort of keyboard thing. Didn't really like Nine Inch Nails when they first came out. It was too industrial sounding to me. I didn't get it. That whole like robotic, the drum machine and the synths and everything, even though there's a lot of guitar and a lot of Nine Inch Nails stuff, and it is pretty heavy and pretty dark. There was way too much like synths in there and kind of drum machine sounds and stuff. I didn't understand it, couldn't get it. But now I really like Nine Inch Nails and the early Nine Inch Nails stuff. I've really gotten into that, exploring his catalog. And again, another person who experiments a lot and does a lot of different things. So are there some bands for you from this, when you were a teenager, first getting into music, that you ignored, that you didn't like, but as you went on and you got older, you learned to appreciate them, you went back, you rediscovered their catalog? Let me know in the comments down below. Till we see you again, make sure you rock hard, ride free.